Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging straight into the fascinating realm of carbenes. These are molecules with a carbon atom that's a bit electron deficient, making them incredibly reactive.
Super reactive.
Think of them as the printers of the molecular world, always poised for a quick reaction.
Yeah, exactly. And our focus today is on a specific one, bicarbomethoxycarbene. It comes from methyl diazomalonate.
Okay.
And what makes this molecule particularly interesting, really, is its ability to exist in two distinct electronic states. We call them singlet and triplet.
The spin states.
Right. And how these states, well, they totally dictate its chemical behavior.
Exactly. It's almost like having two chemically different molecules from the same starting structure.
Yeah.
Now, for chemists, historically, figuring out which state was doing what, that's been a real puzzle, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Untangling the individual contributions of singlet and triplet carbenes, that's often been a significant hurdle.
Right.
Being certain about which spin state is the primary driver in a reaction, that can be quite challenging.
So for this deep dive, our goal is to really understand how the singlet and triplet forms of this specific carbene, bicarbomethoxycarbene, behave differently. We'll be looking closely at their reactions with carbon double bonds, those flexible parts of molecules, and even with the more robust carbon-hydrogen single bond.
Yeah, the CH bonds.
We're digging into a really detailed research study that gives us some crucial insights here.
Yes, this study meticulously looked at a whole range of reactions, everything from making those strained three-membered cyclopropane rings to additions involving molecules like allenes and norbornadine, reactions with benzene, and even, like you said, insertions into the seemingly inert CH bonds of saturated hydrocarbons.
Wow.
It's a really comprehensive picture, how these two carbene states just diverge in the reactivity.
Okay, so how do you even go about generating these two different carbene personalities, the singlet and the triplet in the lab? How did they do it?
The researchers used some pretty elegant photochemical methods. Basically, if you directly irradiate a solution of the precursor, methyl diazomalonate, with light.
Just shine a light on it.
Just shine light on it, yeah. You predominantly generate the singlet bicarbomethoxycarbene.
Okay. Direct light in, singlet carbene out. Seems simple enough. And for the triplet version?
For the triplet state, they use something called photosensitized irradiation.
Okay.
Think of it like a chemical relay race. They add a sensitizer molecule in this study. It was benzophenone.
Benzophenone.
Right, so the benzophenone grabs the light energy first, and then it passes that energy like a baton to the methyl diazomalonate. But it passes it in a way that specifically pushes it into the triplet excited state.
Ah, cool.
It's a way to kind of indirectly control which excited state of the precursor you access.
That's a neat trick to get selective control. Okay, let's jump into how these single and triplet carbenes interact with those carbon double bonds, specifically making those interesting cyclopropane rings. What did the study show there?
Well, what's truly remarkable here is the difference in the stereochemical outcome.
Stereochemistry.
Yeah. So when the singlet carbene adds to an olefin that's just a molecule with a CC double bond, the cyclopropane you get shows significant retention of the olefin's original stereochemistry.
Now, just to clarify for our listeners, when we talk about stereochemistry, we mean the 3D arrangement of atoms.
Yeah.
Right? Like whether bits of the molecule face the same way or opposite ways in space.
Precisely, yeah. Imagine the groups attached to that double bond. They can be on the same side, which we call cis, or on opposite sides, trans.
Got it.
The singlet carbene tends to add in a way that, mostly keeps that spatial arrangement intact in the final cyclopropane.
Okay.
The study gives some clear examples, different olefins, different yields. For instance, with a bulky olefin like 3-dimethyl-1-butene, the cyclopropane yield was only 2%.
Only 2%. Low.
Yeah, maybe steric hindrance, right. Things getting in the way.
Makes sense.
But then 2-balsam-3-dimethyl-2-butene, which is also substituted but differently, gave a much better 28% yield. And they used NMR spectroscopy, of course, to confirm these cyclopropane structures and, importantly, check that the signals from the original double bond were gone.
So the singlet addition seems pretty direct, controlled, preserving the 3D shape. But the study also looked at a cis olefin, cis-4-methyl-2-pentane.
Yes.
And found a small amount, like 8–10% of the trans-cyclopropane mixed in with the main cis product. What's going on there? How do you get that scrambling?
That's a really good point. It wasn't perfectly clean. The researchers suggest that maybe before the carbene even fully forms, an excited state of the diazo compound itself, the methyl diazomalonate, might be involved.
Precursor?
Yeah, the precursor.
Yeah.
This excited diazo thing could potentially add to the double bond first and then maybe undergo some rotation before it finally closes the ring to form the cyclopropane.
Huh.
So even with the singlet pathway, there can be these, subtle complexities. It's not always perfectly straightforward.
Interesting. So the steps before the carbene actually forms can still influence the outcome. Okay. Now, how does the triplet carbene behave with these double bonds? Does it also show this preference for keeping the original geometry?
Not at all. Complete opposite, actually.
Really?
Yeah. The triplet carbene addition to olefins leads to a complete loss of the starting olefins stereochemistry. Doesn't matter if you start with cis or trans.
Wow.
The photosensitized reactions using either cis or trans-4-methyl-2-pentene, they gave very similar mixtures of both cis and trans cyclopropanes in the end.
So it's like the triplet carbene completely forgets what the double bond looked like originally.
Exactly. It erases the memorial, so to speak, of the initial configuration.
That's a really dramatic difference. What's the reason? What's the mechanism behind this total lack of stereospecificity with the triplet?
Well, the generally accepted mechanism is that the triplet carbene doesn't add in one go, not like the singlet's concerted step. Instead, it's thought to first sort of interact with the olefin to form a diradical intermediate. Think of it like a molecule with two unpaired electrons, usually at either end of the original double bond system.
A diradical.
And because you have these unpaired electrons in single bonds where the double bond was, there's free rotation around that bond.
Ah, so it can twist around.
It can twist around freely before the two radical ends finally recombine to close the ring and form the cyclopropane. And that rotation is what scrambles the initial cis or trans geometry.
That makes sense. The diradical lives long enough to rotate. And didn't the study use hexafluorobenzene somehow to probe this?
Yes, they did. That was a clever experiment to get more evidence. Hexafluorobenzene is known sometimes to help with something called intersystem crossing.
Intersystem crossing, a spin flip.
Basically, yeah. It helps molecules flip between singlet and triplet states.
Wow.
So by changing the concentration of hexafluorobenzene, they were trying to see if they could influence the balance between singlet and triplet pathways and see how that affected the products.
And did it?
It did. Figure 1 in the paper shows that as they added more hexafluorobenzene, the amount of the trans-cyclopropane product increased, which fits nicely with the idea that hexafluorobenzene was helping to generate more of the triplet intermediate, which is the one responsible for the scrambled product.
Okay, so that adds more weight to the diradical mechanism for the triplet. So let's recap this bit. Singlet carbene, mostly direct addition, keeps the stereochemistry, probably a concerted mechanism.
Mostly, yes.
Triplet carbene goes through a radical intermediate, rotation happens, total loss of stereochemistry.
That's the core difference. Yeah, a fundamental distinction.
Okay. What happens when bicarbomethoxycarbene reacts with allenes? Those molecules with the two double bonds right next to each other, CCC.
Right, the allenes. They show another interesting contrast. When you decompose the methyl diazomalonate in allene without a sensitizer, so mostly the singlet pathway.
The direct photolysis.
Exactly. It yields only one main product, a ring-substituted one. They call it compound 5 in the study. It's highly selective.
Just one main product. That's very specific. What about when the triplet carbene is involved? Do you get a messier mixture then?
Well, interestingly, the sensitized decomposition in the triplet pathway also primarily yields that same ring-substituted product, compound 5.
Oh.
But they did see a small amount of something else, 11-diphenylethylene. They suggest it might form via an intermediate called an oxetane.
An oxetane.
What's really noteworthy, though, is they didn't detect the expected trimethylmethane intermediate. That's often considered a hallmark of triplet carbene reactions with alanions, but they didn't see it here.
That is unexpected. So even though the triplet often goes via radicals, in this case with alane, it seems to still prefer a specific type of cyclization, ending up mostly with the same main product as the singlet.
It seems so. And it's worth noting this preference for making these ring-substituted products from allenes, it's actually been seen with other triplet carbenes too, like diphenyl carbene and fluorinylidene. So maybe the initial interaction is different between singlet and triplet, but the final product outcome can sometimes converge, especially with these types of systems.
Okay, fascinating. Let's move on to another interesting unsaturated molecule, norbornadine. It's that rigid bicyclic system with two double bonds. What happens there?
Norbornadine. Right. Both the singlet and the triplet biscarbomethoxycarbene add to one of the double bonds in norbornadine. They give two main products, two adducts, labeled 22 and 23 in the paper.
Okay.
These are stereoisomers, One has the biscarbomethoxy group on the exophase sort of pointing away from the rest of the molecule's bulk.
Right. The
The
outside.
other on the endophase pointing sort of inwards towards the other double bond bridge.
So same types of products again, but maybe different amounts depending on singlet versus triplet.
Exactly. The singlet carbene gives these two, the exo 22 and endo 23, in roughly a 68% to 32% ratio, so favoring the exo product.
Okay, 16-8-32.
The triplet carbene from the sensitized reaction shows a slightly different preference. It gives about 79% exo and only 21% endo.
Ah, so even more exo-selective for the triplet.
A bit more, yeah. This subtle shift suggests the triplet might have a slightly different approach, maybe a different transition state leading to these products.
Interesting.
The researchers also mentioned a third compound, 24, that formed during the GC analysis, the gas chromatography.
An artifact.
Yeah, they figured it wasn't a primary product from the actual reaction itself, just something formed during the analysis.
Right. And what about those Diels-Older type reactions, the 1-No-4 additions we sometimes see with conjugated systems? Norbornadine has 2 double bonds. Could it do that here?
Good question. But no, the study found absolutely no evidence of any 2+4 cycloaddition to norbornadine. Not for the singlet, not for the triplet.
Okay.
It really reinforces the general idea that carbenes typically prefer to just add across one double bond, forming the cyclopropane, rather than doing these concerted 1-govern-4 additions.
All right, they stick to the Tolcaro-2 addition. Okay, let's switch gears again. Benzene. That classic aromatic ring.
Right.
Stable stuff. How does our biscarbomethoxy carbene interact with benzene? Singlet versus triplet.
Benzene. So, direct photolysis of methyl diazomalonate in benzene, the singlet pathway gives two main products. There's a norcaridine derivative, compound 45.
Norcaridine, like a cyclopropane fused to a 6-stubbered ring.
Exactly, that's the structure. And the other product is phenolmalonate, compound 46.
Okay, 2 products. What ratio?
The singlet pathway produces them in about a 2.7 to 1 ratio, favoring the norcaridine 45.
2.7 to 1. Got it. And when you generate the triplet carbene in benzene,
The photosensitized reaction, the triplet pathway, also gives the same two products, 45 and 46, but the ratio shifts.
just how?
It's about 1.6 to 1, so still favoring the norcaridine, but less so. And importantly, there's a relative increase in the amount of the phenolmalonate of 46 compared to the singlet reaction.
More phenolmalonate from the triplet.
Well, this fits with the idea that the triplet carbene might add to the benzene ring first to form a diradical intermediate, similar to the olefin case.
Okay.
And this diradical intermediate might have a better chance, or maybe more time, to undergo a hydrogen shift to form the phenolmalonate, rather than just closing up to the norcaridine structure, which seems to be the more direct route for the singlet.
I see. So even with stable old benzene, the spin state can kind of nudge the reaction towards different outcomes via different intermediates. Okay, last category. Reactions with those seemingly boring carbon-hydrogen single bonds in saturated hydrocarbons, alkanes. This is often where selectivity differences really show up, right?
Absolutely. This is where we often see some of the clearest mechanistic differences between singlet and triplet carbenes.
Really?
So both direct photolysis, singlet, and sensitized decomposition, triplet, of the diazomalonate in alkanes like N-pentane or isobutane.
Yeah.
They both result in the carbene inserting into CH bonds.
Insertion. So the carbene literally wedges itself into a CH bond, like CH becomes CC. Carbene.
That's exactly it. It creates a new CC bond and formally a new CH bond within the malonate part. It's like it just jams itself into the middle of that single bond.
Wild. And is there a preference for where it inserts?
Yes. And here's a key difference. The study found that the sensitized decomposition, the triplet reaction, showed slightly higher selectivity for inserting into tertiary CH bonds.
Tertiary? The ones on carbons attached to 3 other carbons.
Exactly. Higher selectivity for tertiary over secondary and secondary over primary CH bonds compared to the direct photolysis, the singlet reaction. Table 6 in the paper shows these relative rates quite clearly.
So the triplet is a bit pickier. It prefers the more substituted, maybe weaker CH bonds.
Seems that way, yes. A bit more discerning. But perhaps even more revealing is that the sensitized triplet reaction gave lower overall yields of these direct insertion products compared to the singlet reaction.
Lower yields. What else did it form?
It also produced compounds you'd expect from free radical chemistry. Things like dimers formed from the hydrocarbon radicals, and products resulting from the carbenes simply abstracting a hydrogen atom.
Ah, hydrogen abstraction. So the triplet isn't inserting directly.
The evidence strongly suggests its main reaction with alkanes is to first pluck off a hydrogen atom. That creates an alkyl radical from the alkane and a malonate radical. These radicals can then combine to give the insertion product, sure, but they can also do other radical things like dimerize or react further.
Okay, so that explains the lower yield of simple insertion and the presence of other radical-derived products. So singlet, mostly direct CH insertion. Triplet, primarily hydrogen abstraction first, then radical recombination or other radical reaction.
That's the picture that emerges, yes. A really fundamental difference in how they attack even these simple CH bonds.
And they actually synthesize the expected insertion products, the outcome malonic esters, just to be sure they knew what they were looking at.
They did. That was crucial, really. Synthesizing compounds 48 through 53 independently allowed them to use NMR and GC to unambiguously confirm the identity of the products they were getting from the carbene reactions. Good standard practice.
Definitely. Okay, one last piece of the puzzle. The study also compared the relative rates at which the singlet and triplet carbenes add to different olefins. Any key trends pop out there?
Yes, Table Foy has some really valuable data comparing them side by side. One really significant finding is about dienes molecules with 2 double bonds, usually conjugated.
Like butadiene.
Exactly, like 1,3-butadiene or 2,5,3-1-val-3-butadiene. The triplet carbene showed a 3 to 4-fold increase in its relative rate of addition to these dienes compared to simple monolefins.
Faster reaction with dienes for the triplet. Why would that be?
Well, it fits perfectly with the diradical intermediate idea again. If the triplet adds to 1 double bond to form a radical, that radical is next to another double bond in a diene. It can be stabilized by resonance, delocalized over the pi system.
Ah, resonance stabilization of the intermediate.
Makes the reaction easier, faster.
Precisely. That stabilization makes the whole addition process more favorable for the triplet when a second double bond is available nearby.
Makes sense. What about the singlet carbenes rates with those same dienes? Did they speed up too?
Much less so. The singlet carbenes' relative rates weren't nearly as affected by having conjugated double bonds around.
Which also fits.
It does. It's consistent with its proposed concerted one-step addition mechanism. There's no radical intermediate that needs stabilizing, so the presence of a second double bond doesn't offer the same kind of advantage.
Consistent picture emerging. Were there any olefins that reacted noticeably faster or slower with one state versus the other?
Yes, interestingly, the study noted that some olefins like 2,4,2-dimethyl-2-butene and cis-4-methyl-2-pentene, the ones you talked about earlier,
right,
they actually showed slower addition rates with the triplet carbene compared to the singlet.
Slower for the triplet. Why? The researchers speculated it might be due to steric hindrance again. Maybe those bulky methyl groups around the double bond make it harder for the triplet to get in there and do the initial hydrogen abstraction or form the initial bond needed for the diradical pathway.
So bulkiness might hinder the triplet more than the singlet in some cases.
Possibly. They did caution that more research would be needed to confirm if that's a general trend, but it was an interesting observation for those specific olefins.
Okay, wow. We've really dug deep into the contrasting personalities of singlet and triplet bis-carbomethoxycarbene across quite a range of reactions. Let's try and summarize the key takeaways. What are the absolute biggest differences we've uncovered?
I think the most striking contrasts, the ones that really stick out, are definitely in the stereochemistry of cyclopropane formation. Remember, singlet largely preserves the geometry.
Keeps it cis or trans.
While the triplet completely scrambles it. Total loss of information. And the other big one is the reaction with saturated CH bonds. Singlet goes for direct insertion. Triplet prefers to abstract a hydrogen first, leading to radical chemistry.
2 totally different ways of interacting with those bonds.
Exactly. These differences really underscore the distinct mechanistic pathways these 2 spin states prefer to take.
It's truly remarkable how fundamentally different these 2 forms of effectively the same molecule can be in their chemical reactivity. This research really paints a much clearer picture of these differences in solution, which, as you said, has historically been pretty tricky to nail down.
Absolutely. By carefully picking apart these reactions using direct versus sensitized photolysis, the researchers provided really valuable insights. It helps us understand the fundamental principles governing how carbenes react.
And that has real implications, right, for organic synthesis.
Huge implications. If we understand these differences, maybe we can start to design reactions better, control them more effectively, perhaps even selectively generate one spin state over the other to drive a reaction towards a specific desired product.
Which leads perfectly into a final thought, maybe something for our listeners to chew on. Thinking about these distinct reactivity profiles,
Yeah.
how might chemists really leverage this knowledge? How can we selectively generate and then harness either the singlet or the triplet state to achieve specific chemical goals, to build new and useful molecules?
Yeah, and maybe thinking beyond just the spin state, what other factors, subtle things perhaps, might we use to further fine-tune a carbine's reactivity and steer it down exactly the path we want? Sterics, solvents, additives.
Lots to think about there. Definitely some fascinating questions to ponder. Thanks for joining me on this really insightful deep dive.